Well, let us turn our attention to 1914. By golly, I've got some questions for you about this wonderful book. So we'll talk about the past when there's no social distancing, there's no COVID-19. By God, they didn't know how good they had it.
Well, they had other difficulties on the way.
Oh, absolutely. As this book illustrates many. So I promise not to summarize your book and spoil it and do a terrible job. I would never do that to you. If you would, please tell esteemed audience a little bit about Daring Darleen.
So Daring Darleen is about a girl named Darleen who has just grown out of her first career, which was as a star, as a sort of child star in silent films where she would be made adorable. And then she was Darling Darleen. And now she's outgrown that L, and she's become Daring Darleen, and she's the heroine in adventure serials, which are actually an incredibly popular fad in the teens. So it was this amazing moment where film was becoming a big business, and it was learning how to keep people strung along in a story. And they wanted to get people to come back to the theaters again and again, week after week, week after week, to see the films. And so they thought, oh, you know what we'll serialize things. So we'll have adventures that stretch out over many, many short films. Sometimes those adventures would be complete in one episode, and then you'd wait and you'd get another episode that sort of told a different story. And often they would have cliffhangers at the end, so that you would come back for the next episode. And these were incredibly popular in the teens. So you had things like The Perils of Pauline and The Hazards of Helen. So my character, Darleen, is in The Dangers of Darleen, and it's being filmed in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which was sort of, you could call it the Hollywood of its day. Hollywood already existed a little bit in 1914, but it was not yet absolutely completely dominant. It would become so pretty soon after this book, actually because of World War I, which is going to start after the end of this story. But then it became even more pressing to get to the warm Californian shores where there was light all year round, and you didn't have to use a lot of coal to heat your studios. So New Jersey did not look anywhere as good once coal became a shortage during the war. Anyway, so her family is at a studio in Fort Lee called Matchless Studios, which is a name I'm incredibly proud of having thought up. There were lots and lots of different movie studios in Fort Lee, and one of them did have the name Peerless, and so I'm kind of riffing on that for Matchless, but then there's a pun because the thing about movie studios is that just like the Scarecrow, the one thing they really were worried about was a lighted match. They were incredibly flammable places. They had chemicals going, and celluloid film was incredibly flammable, and the whole thing was very dangerous. And every now and then, these studios would burn down. So my studio is called Matchless. And she's making these adventure serials, and her extended family that's busy working at the studio decides that what they want to do to get people to come and see the films is they're going to stage a fake kidnapping of Darleen at the opening of a big theater, the Strand Theater in New York City, in April 1914. Historical, really happened, the opening of the theater part. So completely plausible. Anyway, and of course, the fake kidnapping goes awry and turns into a real kidnapping, and she ends up being really kidnapped with an heiress named Victorine. And even though they have just completely different backgrounds and so on, the two girls have to work together and do all sorts of actual sort of stunts and so on to get themselves out of the clutches of the kidnappers and get back to the movie studios and be making the next episode of the adventure serial while continuing to avoid and eventually trap kidnappers. So that's the story. It's basically meant to be a little bit of an echo of the old adventure serials. I try to have cliffhanger endings of the chapters. You know, it wants to keep going at a certain clip. They get to do all sorts of adventures on the screen and off, all sorts of stunts. I'm really interested in silent film tricks. I teach film history. I teach the early part of film history. And one of the things I love most is seeing students amazed by the kinds of special effects that silent film could produce, even though they did not have post-production, they did not have computers, and in the early days, all of those special effects had to be done in the camera. So you had to be doing those special effects somehow while you were running your camera, making the film. And that's incredibly hard to do. So in that class, we do a lot of looking at things, and then I'll say, okay, how'd they do that, right? How'd they do that? And we'll try to figure out how they did that. And so there's a lot of that comes up in Daring Darleen, because those film tricks are just so much fun. I couldn't resist it.
Wasn't the answer sometimes the special effect was just a reckless endangerment and disregard for human life?
Right. That is a good point. So, yeah, one of the things about these, the adventure serials that were so popular in the teens was that they tended to star young women. And the young women were asked to do all sorts of incredibly dangerous things, like leaping leaping onto trains, off of bridges, riding motorcycles, off bridges into the river, flying away in hot air balloons. I mean, all sorts of incredibly dangerous things. And part of the marketing for the adventure serials was convincing the public that these were real. Sometimes they were actually pretty real. I mean, certainly they were being asked to do some tricks that were riskier than anything that we would ask people to do now. But of course, movie magic also had its role to play, and editing was used to make some of these tricks look more convincing. But I was really fascinated by these early film stars like Pearl White and Helen Holmes, who are starring in these adventure serials. So that they were part of the model for Daring Darleen. She's a few years younger than they are, but okay, that's plausible. The other parent for her, sort of fictional parent or real parent, I don't know whether I'm real or fictional at this point, but is a child star from the silent period whom I met, named Baby Peggy. That was what her working name was as a small child. She actually lived until this February, so she lived to the age of 101, and she came to this silent film festival that I go to every year, the largest silent film festival in the world. Happens every year in Italy, so who knows whether it will happen this year. But she came, and we watched her films from when she was a very small child, acting in all sorts of different kinds of films, and she would talk about what it was like being a child star during the silent period. And it was so inspiring because you could see how brilliant she was. I mean, she had been brilliant as a child. What they were asking kids to do in these films, again, just as they were asking a lot from the adventure serial heroines, they were asking a lot from the kids acting in the films. They had to be able to do all sorts of things, act incredibly well, follow instructions really well. It's amazing what they could do. So she was also a kind of inspiration, although she was a child star a few years later than my Darleen, because it was the early 20s when she was in her heyday as a child star. But But anyway, yeah, it was that sort of that combination of the adventure heroine and the silent film child star that I wanted to roll together into one for my Darleen.